What's going on, folks, and welcome back to Stu's Garage. Today what we're going to talk about V8 swaps in cars in general. I'm going to tell you about some of the obstacles that I've had to face, some of the puzzles I've had to solve, particularly with this LS swap, and I'm just going to kind of give you guys some pointers that you're going to want to look at with any type of motor swap you're going to do in general. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So if you haven't been following along, I'm working on putting an LS motor into my 1990 Fox Body Mustang. A lot of people are going to be upset about that, but you know, we're not going to worry about that today. You know, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. This is what I'm doing, and that's what it is. So first off, as far as motor swaps go, you know, a lot of people tend to think that because LS swaps are common, they're easy. And that's not necessarily the case. It's just that people have been doing them for so long. The information and resources tend to be out there, and it tends to be a little bit easier to find those oddball parts that you need. But you still have to figure that stuff out for yourself, or have somebody on hand that knows those individual nuances and things like that. Back in the old school, you know, you had big giant cars with big giant engine bays. Even though they had large engines, it was never a problem fitting. So the first thing that you're going to want to worry about in a motor swap is, will the motor fit? I like the LS style motor because it's such a small, compact form factor. This motor here is actually smaller than the 305 that came out physically on the outside. The LS motor fits in the space of any inline six, so that's a lot of performance cars out there. It'll fit in space of a lot of 4-cylinders and even some V6 cars. So you can pretty much stick an LS into anything. And the cool thing about it is, once this motor goes in, I'm still going to have tons of space to work on it. If you go with other kind of popular dual overhead cam motors, you know, some of the newer school stuff, dual overhead cam motors are enormous. So just to kind of put that into perspective, this is a single cam motor, which means the cam goes through the middle, and then push rods go up through the heads to actuate the valves and everything. On a dual overhead cam motor, your heads are going to be like twice the size. So, you know, instead of just sticking up to here, you know, the heads are going to be all the way up here. You know, they're going to be freaking huge, and that takes up a lot of space in your engine bay. It makes your motor taller and wider. You can still fit them, but you're going to have a hard time doing a lot of other things with a dual overhead cam V8 motor. It's a very large motor. So the LS is a very small motor. So back to the point, old school cars, they did a lot of motor swaps back in the day because anything fit into anything. Nowadays, your cars are a little bit smaller. You have to take size into consideration. So on to my next point, electronics. Those of you all who followed along know that a month ago or so, I swapped out my dash for an M3 dash, and while it was for cosmetic reasons, one of the other reasons why I did that is to kind of take out some of the proprietary electronics that are proprietary to the Ford Fox Body and kind of make things universal. Back in old school, you know, everything was universal, everything talked to everything. Nobody really had their own stuff going on. Everything was just kind of plug and play. So that's basically what my goal was, is to make this chassis only talk to the chassis, you know, and the motor is basically going to be its own separate entity. And when this car is ready, which it is now, I could literally drop any motor into this car and basically plug it into power and get it to fit, and it'll be ready to roll without me having to worry about a lot of other things. And I'll show you some of that stuff in a minute. So let's actually talk about some of the parts that goes into it. So this motor actually has to go onto something. So what we've done here is we've removed the stock K member and we've gone with an aftermarket K member. In this particular instance, this is actually a 4.6 style K member, which happens to fit in the Fox Body because the chassis to the 4.6 cars are very similar. So this is a 4.6 K member. Let's go over here to the motor, which is the LS motor, and as you can see down there, we've got 4.6 motor mounts. But the reason why the 4.6 motor mounts work on the LS is because I put these adapter plates in, which you can see they're the chrome pieces down here. Now the adapter plates didn't line up perfectly. I had to do a little bit of grinding on them and drilling the holes out to get the holes to match up perfectly. But the motor mounts went on. So now that we've got the motor mounts on, the next thing we have to talk about is headers, because this motor was never meant to go inside this car. There aren't necessarily headers out there that are meant to wrap around the trans-tunnel firewall area the way that the Ford style headers would have. So what you can do is get custom made headers. You can get headers that are made for your swap, which I lucked out. I actually got swap headers. So these are the Hedman swap headers that are actually made for this motor and this car, which I really lucked out on. But kind of the funny thing about these headers, and this is where stuff starts to get funny as far as motor swap goes, the folks that made these headers didn't necessarily expect you to use a 4.6 style mount. They kind of expected you to use a different style mount, which is a little bit smaller. So when I put these headers and mounts together, I actually had to do some trimming to the motor mount in order to get everything to fit. So those are the kind of issues that you run into, because you've got parts coming from so many different sources. They don't necessarily always play well together. So next up, since we're talking about headers, let's go ahead and talk about exhaust. So your headers are actually going to come down in a different location, because your motor is going to be a different size than the original and different dimensions. So your stock exhaust may not necessarily work. So I looked up and I got a whole custom exhaust that was actually on another LS Fox body. But just know that your exhaust isn't just going to bolt up. You're probably going to have to do some cutting. If you have a Y pipe or an H pipe or anything like that, it's probably not going to line up to the header. So you're going to have to get that to line up. Next up is your ECU and electronics. So for an LS swap, the most popular and probably the most economic option is for people to go for the HP Tuner setup, which is basically a computer program that allows you to connect your computer to a stock LS ECU, and you can basically control it like an aftermarket computer. There's also things you can do to your wiring harness to make your wiring harness like a standalone harness. For me, I went with a whole standalone wiring harness. It's an aftermarket harness, which is right here. And this harness basically makes everything easy for me. It all plugs into the motor, and then so basically it plugs into the motor with these, it plugs into the ECU with like 2 of these fat plugs, and then there's different wires coming out of it here. So there's like a power, there's a ground, there's a wire that goes to your fans, a wire that goes to your fuel, and a couple of other wires. But basically this is like a dummy proof harness, and that's why I got it, because I didn't want to spend time cutting and splicing a factory harness trying to figure that out, and then if something doesn't work, I don't necessarily know where my problem is. So I went the extra mile here and spent a little bit of money and got the standalone harness. I also went and got a standalone ECU, and this was a personal preference because I came from a Megasquirt 3 setup. I really liked it and I really wanted to stick with it, so I went and got this version of a Megasquirt 3. But if you're looking at an LS swap, I would highly advise to go the HP Tuners route. So next up, we're going to talk about transmissions and clutches and what you're going to do there. So there's 3 routes that you can go as far as your transmission goes. There's your easiest route if you're doing an LS or whatever motor you decide to do, is to go with the transmission that motor was made for. So in the case of the LS, a T56 swap would be the easiest, the absolute easiest thing to do, because you don't have to worry about figuring out what part matches with what. You just buy the standard stuff. You buy a T56, you buy a T56 clutch, T56 throwout bearing, all of that stuff, because it's all made to go together. You just stick with the year, make and model of whatever the car came out of, and you can buy all of those parts. The second option, which is a very popular option, is to go with a 350Z transmission. And Collins makes all types of adapters and kits that you can use a 350Z transmission on just about anything. That option is going to run you about the same as a T56. However, the benefit of going with a 350Z transmission is the cost of the transmission itself. They're very cheap. So if you trash your 350Z transmission, yes, you spent the money up front. It's probably only going to cost you about, maybe $600 to replace that transmission. All of the other hardware remains in place. If you trash a T56, it's probably going to cost you close to $2,000 to replace it. So that's where your benefit comes in with the 350Z transmission. The third option is to go with an aftermarket transmission, and that's the most difficult option, and that's what I'm doing, and that's going to cause me some issues, which I'll talk about in a second. I have a TKO 600, which I'm sticking with just because I already have it and to save money. So with the TKO, I have to get a custom bell housing because the 5.0 bell housing that you see back there isn't going to work. So actually, it's actually after 9 o'clock, and the UPS man just dropped this off. It's really late, and I've been waiting all day for this to come in. The UPS man just dropped it off. But this is a custom QuickTime bell housing that is meant to connect a Ford-style TKO transmission to an LS motor. I want to take a moment and give another quick shout out to my buddy Chris Kaysen over at Mustang Parts Fast, who absolutely totally sped up my research time and helped out this build by basically knowing all the parts that I needed in order to make my transmission stuff work. Actually, they made a mistake and they sent me the wrong bell housing, which is under there, which I found out 2 days ago. I hit him up, he apologized, and he got me this thing out in 2 days. No questions asked. Didn't even ask me about sending this one back yet. You know, no hassle there. I do have to send that one back, but as you can see, within 2 days, they got me the correct bell housing, and these things are made to order. And you know, he pulled this thing out of somewhere. So I really appreciate you, Chris. Thanks for your help. And if I ever need parts again, I will definitely order from these guys, and you guys should too. So yeah, this is what a custom bell housing looks like. So with the custom bell housing, you can only use a particular style clutch. So on an LS motor, I believe there are 2 types of clutches you can get. You can get the Corvette style clutch, or you can get a Camaro style clutch. I believe the Camaro style clutch is smaller, so if I had bought a Corvette style clutch, I would have been out of luck. Luckily, since the TKO has the same splines as a T56, I didn't have a whole lot of issues there. So this is the clutch that I went with. The clutch and flywheel package that I went with. The flywheel is already on the motor. Now they did send it with this pilot bearing. I believe that this is an LS1 style pilot bearing, but since I'm using a Ford style transmission, I'll just go ahead and show you. This is not going to fit a Ford transmission. See there? It's too small because this is made for a T56. So what I actually had to do is get a custom made pilot bearing. Very expensive custom made pilot bearing. Okay, so here is my custom pilot bearing, and as you can see, it's a little bit frosty because I've been keeping it in the freezer because it helps to press these things in when you freeze them because they get a little bit smaller and they slide in a little bit easier. Alright folks, so the camera died on me while I was showing you the pilot bearing, but not sure where I left off, so if I end up repeating myself or if the continuity is funny, that's the end. That's the reason why. So anyways, like I was saying, this is my pilot bearing. What it looks like to me is what they did is take a Ford pilot bearing, which is this silver centerpiece down here, not just this ring, but this whole silver piece. And it looks like they machined out a sleeve for it made out of brass, and that actually matches the diameter of the crankshaft on the LS motor. So that's that. I went ahead and tapped it in this morning. I've got it sticking halfway in because that's kind of what's suggested in order to basically preserve the life of your transmission. I guess by default, when you press them all the way in, they don't fully engage the output shaft, the input shaft on your transmission. But this is kind of like a hot rodder's trick to get things to work properly. Okay, so working backwards after we've addressed all of your transmission stuff, I want to talk to you about your drive shaft really quick. First First of all, whatever transmission combination you go with, you're going to have to make sure that you have the correct yoke to go into your transmission and connect to your drive shaft. So the TKO takes its own style yoke. Just really depends on the output shaft of your transmission. So you have to make sure that the yoke matches the output shaft. Now, for your drive shaft, you're going to have to get that either shortened or lengthened depending on the overall length of whatever your swap ends up to be. For my application, this is going to have to come down about 2 inches, especially with the IRS installed. It's already, basically, it's already too long for what I've been doing anyway. I really have to cram this thing into the car when I put it in, and it's really difficult. So I'm going to have to shorten this. Every swap's going to be different, so that's just what you're going to have to familiarize yourself with. Lastly, I went ahead and got the bell housing mocked up to the transmission, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what to do with the clutch fork. So a lot of people are telling me that I won't be able to run a cable style clutch fork with this motor transmission combo, and that's because if you look here, this is actually the hole that the cable will pass through, and as you can see how short the clutch fork is, the cable's going to have to go at a slanted angle, and that's just not going to work. It's just not going to be able to pull that way. It needs to be able to pull straight forwards and backwards. So what I'm thinking about doing is actually extending my clutch fork so that it comes out to here. But the problem with that is that the transmission tunnel gets really narrow right here, and it probably passes through just like this. I don't think I'm going to have enough space to actually have a long enough clutch fork. So I may actually have to cut or bang in my transmission tunnel in order to make that clearance, and I'm okay with that. It's just a hassle. I have to figure out how much space I need. Also, now that I've got this mocked up, the clutch fork is not moving. I think what I need to do is actually get an adjustable pivot ball, or maybe a new clutch fork. I don't really know at this point, so I shot a question to Chris this morning, my buddy Chris Kaysen. He had some suggestions for me, so I'm gonna have to work on that. You know, if anybody watching has experience with that, definitely let me know, because that's pretty much putting things on hold. It's not a huge issue. I really am trying to do everything I can not to convert to hydraulic, because that's going to add another $400 to this thing, and probably a day or 2 days worth of install time, plus drama I just don't want. I don't want a hydraulic setup. So but I will if I have to, but I really just don't want it. So that's pretty much it with the video, folks. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little talking video to kind of show you an update of everything that's going on. Here's a preview for what's coming up in the next video. I'm really excited about these guys. So these are actually going to make the car track worthy for road racing. So that's pretty much it, folks. Thanks for watching the video. And you know, next time you see me, we'll actually be hopefully dropping this stuff into the car. So actually we're off to Team Vibes later today. Look out for an awesome drift video coming up. Catch you guys next time.